Let me take you back to the exact moment the air changed in Madrid, not with a thunderclap, not with an upset serve or a broken racket. It happened after the match was already over, after the winner had already walked off the court, after the world had already decided what it wanted to applaud. Aryna Sabalenka had just done what Aryna Sabalenka does. She dominated. 6-1, 6-4, clean, surgical, the kind of win that usually comes with a soundtrack of roaring approval and slow-motion replays of her fiercest winners. She walked off like a champion walking through a door that belongs to her, and then she didn't keep walking. She grabbed the microphone instead. And what came out of her mouth stopped everyone cold. "When you guys were cheering more for her, I was a little bit upset. So next time please, nobody expected this." Let that land the way it landed in that stadium. This wasn't a qualifier begging for scraps of attention. This wasn't a player on a losing streak, fragile and grasping for validation. This was the world number one, the woman with 25 wins in 2026 and only one loss, a three-time champion already this season, and it wasn't even summer yet, standing on her own stage, trophy fresh in hand, and telling the crowd that they'd been cheering for the wrong person. Bold, absolutely, almost reckless in its honesty, but here what made that moment genuinely explosive, not just controversial, it wasn't what she said, it was why she felt she had to say it at all. Because just days before that microphone grab, something quiet had shifted in Madrid, something nobody saw coming, least of all the tournament organizers. At the Laureus World Sports Awards 2026, Sabalenka accepted the trophy for Sportswoman of the Year. And in the same breath she admitted something that felt almost unbearable for an athlete of her caliber. She said she wanted to vanish from the spotlight, to disappear into a corner where nobody was looking. That's not a quote you expect from someone who just conquered her sport. That's exhaustion wearing a crown. Across that same room that night, 21-year-old Alex Ila walked in wearing something that had nothing to do with hiding. She wore a breathtaking Filipino gown, designed by her own uncle, every thread of it woven with cultural memory and pride. She didn't shrink, she didn't deflect. She owned every single second of the spotlight, not as an intruder, but as someone who had been raised to stand exactly there. Pure, unapologetic cultural pride on a global stage. Two athletes, two opposite energies, and the city of Madrid was about to feel the difference like a tectonic plate shifting under clay courts. 2 days later, Ila stepped onto the Aryna Sanchez Stadium. Her opponent was Anastasia Pavlyuchenkova, a name that usually commands respect before a ball is struck. But the story wasn't about respect anymore. It was about sound, because from the first point the stands weren't just cheering, they were announcing something, Filipino fans roaring like they'd been waiting their whole lives for this moment. Representatives from the Philippine embassy sitting courtside, watching history happen in real time, probably texting the ambassador before the first set was even over. The scoreboard read 6-3, 6-3, but the scoreboard never tells the full story. Mid-interview, Ila did something that turned a win into a moment. She switched into flawless Spanish, looked at the crowd, and said exactly what they wanted to hear, not because she was performing, but because she meant it. "I love Madrid." The crowd lost its collective mind. The clip went viral within hours. She hadn't just won a match. She had announced herself to the entire world, not with arrogance, but with belonging. And then the tournament made a decision that, in hindsight, nobody can quite explain without wincing. Her next match against Elise Mertens was moved to a smaller outer court, Court 5, no packed stadium, no roaring, flag-waving, history-making crowd, just a fraction of the atmosphere that had launched her into the global conversation just 48 hours earlier. The buzz that had been building for days got quietly squeezed into a corner of the complex, like a fire someone tried to smother instead of fuel. The result followed the energy. She lost 2-6, 1-6, but here's the part that matters more than the numbers. Before the final point, before the handshake, before the disappointment could fully settle, she walked to the umpire's chair mid-match and said something clear and calm and unforgettable. "First of all, please let me speak." That wasn't drama, that wasn't a tantrum, that was a player refusing to be made invisible, refusing to let the moment be taken from her without a fight. She didn't ask for sympathy, she asked for the floor. Now here's the image that tells you everything about what really happened in Madrid, the part that no box score will ever capture. While Ila's fans were packed into Court 5, unable to move, unable to breathe, unable to recreate the electricity they'd built 2 days earlier on a bigger stage, Aryna Sabalenka was playing simultaneously on the massive Manolo Santana Stadium. Full capacity, every seat taken. A stadium designed for exactly this kind of occasion. And still, she felt the crowd's energy wasn't hers. That's not a coincidence, that's a story wearing a disguise. Ila came into this tournament ranked 44th in the world. fresh off a career high of 29, the highest any Filipino woman has ever climbed in WTA history. But none of her fans were there for a number. They were there for something you can't rank, can't seed, can't schedule into a convenient time slot. They were there for the feeling of watching history happen in real time, of being part of something that wasn't just a tennis match but a homecoming to a place they'd never physically been. Her uncle Ridella, the man who designed that iconic Filipiniana gown, said something that should be printed and framed. He said he's proud to be known simply as Alex Elas Tito. Think about that for a second. That's not just family loyalty. That's a cultural movement wearing an uncle's smile. When your own family redefines their identity around your courage, you're no longer just an athlete, you're an ancestor in training. And when the tournament moved her to an outer court, they didn't kill that energy. You can't kill something that was never theirs to begin with. They just displaced it. It spilled out through the hallways, into the tunnels, into the bathrooms where fans whispered plans. It leaked into the atmosphere and drifted all the way to the main arena, where Sabalenka eventually called it out on the microphone in front of everyone, not as a villain, but as someone who suddenly understood she wasn't the only story in town. Here's the bigger picture, though. The one the headlines will miss because they're chasing recaps instead of resonances. This was Sabalenka's first clash with forces outside her control. Earlier this season, she publicly pushed back at a tournament director over comments about withdrawal penalties. She called them ridiculous. She questioned whether she'd even return to the event. Now the roles have quietly reversed. The same player who once threatened to boycott a tournament is now being challenged by a crowd she can't control either. That symmetry isn't random. It reveals something real, something uncomfortable, something true. A growing tension between demanding the spotlight and earning it, between standing on a stage and sharing it. And while all of this was unfolding, there was a spectacular exhibition at the Santiago Bernabeu Stadium. Nadal, Sinner, Swiatek. Tennis turned into a global celebration, pulling millions of eyes toward the sport from people who don't usually watch tennis at all. Sabalenka sat it out, saying she wanted to focus on competition, which is understandable, even admirable. But symbolically, while everyone else was expanding what tennis could be, louder, bigger, more theatrical, more joyful, she stepped away from the biggest room in the building. The contrast wrote itself. Greg Rusedski, former world number 4, one of the sharpest analytical minds in the sport, watched Ila's loss and didn't reach for sympathy like a default setting. He reached for one word instead: resilience. In tennis, that word isn't comfort. It's not a hug in verbal form, it's a projection. It's what separates the players who flash briefly across the sky like fireworks from the ones who build something that lasts through the boring years, the bad draws, the silent stadiums. Because what happened in Madrid wasn't really about scheduling. It was a misread of reality. The Philippine embassy showed up. Fans traveled across continents, spent money they didn't have, took days off work they couldn't afford, all to stand in a small outer court and scream for someone who represents something larger than a ranking. The energy inside the Aryna Sabalenka stadium on her first match day wasn't something a tournament manufactured. You cannot manufacture that. It was something people brought in their chests, in their flags, in the names they whispered to their children before bed. And the WTA is starting to notice that this fan base isn't a trend. Trends fade, this is a foundation. From here, Ila heads into the Catalonia Open as a 6th seed, then the Italian Open, then the French Open. And every tournament from this point forward faces the same unavoidable question, the one that schedulers and seeders and sponsors are going to have to answer out loud. What do you do with a player whose following is bigger than her draw position? Because Sabalenka won in Madrid, the trophy will say so, the record book will say so, but the story followed Ila home. That inversion says everything. Real crowd power, the kind that crosses oceans, mobilizes communities, fills stadiums without needing permission, without waiting for a favorable time slot, without apologizing for its volume, isn't something a tournament assigns to a player. It's something people build together, match by match, flag by flag, scream by scream. The Filipino fan base didn't wait for a ranking to tell them when to believe. They showed up early, they showed up loud, they showed up together, and they didn't stop showing up just because someone moved their player to a smaller court. So if Madrid was just the preview, if that was the appetizer, the trailer, the first chapter, then what happens when she finally steps onto a court that can actually hold the weight of what's behind her? What happens when the stage is finally big enough for the story that's already outgrown every smaller court they try to hide her on? The sport might not be ready for that answer yet. But you are, you've read this far, you felt the shift before the explanation. So don't just sit there, drop your prediction below, mark your calendar for the French Open. Tell a friend who doesn't follow tennis that something is happening they'll want to see. And if you want to be here when this story reaches its next chapter, When the crowd finally fits the moment, when the court finally holds the history, when the girl in the Filipiniana gown steps onto center stage and the whole world has to find a seat, then make sure you don't miss it. Or miss it. But you won't because you're already here.